So now we'll turn to the next item, which is the Land Development Code revision, the transportation aspects of it.
Good afternoon, Chair, Council members, Anique Baudet, here with leadership members of the Land Development Code revision team. I need to lower this chair. Oh, there we go. All right. So we are here to brief you all on, oh, it's advancing by itself. Where did that go? To brief you on the transportation components of the Land Development Code and answer any questions that you may have at this time. This is a reminder for the public about the Land Development Code. As you all know, and I want to thank you for the town halls that you all have hosted over the last month in October, where we've been talking with the community about what is the Land Development Code and getting feedback on the code, what it is and what it isn't, highlighting that our code needs to be updated to meet the needs and priorities of Austin today. And also important is the fact that the Land Development Code is not our only solution to addressing our challenges and opportunities, and that we have many other concurrent programs that have to work together with the code. So again, thank you for getting folks out to talk about the code in October. We had a very successful October out in the community. So while out in the community, we were deep diving on the council direction from May 2nd on the scope of the code, why are we revising the code, specifically housing capacity, affordability, the concept of missing middle housing, compatibility, and also parking. So we, on October 4th, released our staff recommendation. And then throughout the month of October, we took a lot of feedback from the community. And as you know, on October 25th, we released a supplemental staff report with some refinement to our staff recommendation and also some other changes that we'd like to make as we move forward with the process. So that was on October 25th. And it's been working with the community and hearing how we can make it better based on the guideposts that council gave us on May 2nd. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Upal Barua and Danielle Morin to go through the transportation elements specifically, and then I'll come back and talk about what's next. And specifically, we have a few more areas for input with regards to submitting a map, if folks want to, with regards to suggestions on the mapping, and I'll go through that later. So we go straight to parking, and Danielle's going to take that slide. Whoa, why is this? Sorry about that.
Thanks.
It's not wanting to stay, Danielle.
That's okay. Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I can start. Danielle Morin, ATD. So the feedback that we heard from council and the community was to ensure that accessible parking was abundant and that we could achieve it.
So let's. Which one are we on?
Yeah, so this is the fourth slide, accessible parking. So basically, in current code, accessible parking is based on Appendix A, which is the parking table in the LDC. If no parking is required on a site or no parking is provided on a site, with the current code, accessible parking is based on 20% of parking. So, for example, if you have 10 parking spaces that are required, however, the development provides 0 parking spaces, 2 parking spaces the accessible parking spaces are based on the 2 parking spaces, and that's kind of convoluted and difficult to understand. However, in the new LDC, we mirrored it after the affordability unlocked ordinance. All of the feedback that we received from the ADA community, we took that to ensure that accessible parking is now based on 100% of the parking requirements. So at the end of the day, we'll be getting more ADA parking on site. versus the current code. So that's the improvement for accessible parking, or the change. Parking overall in the new LDC is reduced in certain areas. We like to refer to it more as we've right-sized the parking requirements for the city. We took council direction to allow for zero parking for developments that are located within a quarter mile of transit priority corridors. And the way that we're doing that is that we will allow for, go back there we go. Nope. Yeah, we will allow for no parking on site if there is an accessible sidewalk from the development to the corridor. If there is not an accessible sidewalk, the developer has the opportunity to construct that sidewalk, and it would be from their development to the corridor. The other option is that if the development is located on a high or very high sidewalk priority index per the ASMP, in our discussions with Public Works, it's our understanding, excuse me, that about 70% of our sidewalks in those areas will be constructed by 2024. So our thought process behind that is that if we allow that zero parking, the fee in lieu that we would allow would go towards that construction in the future. What is next? Parking maximum. I will not touch the remote because it will move. So currently there's a parking maximum that does exist in the CBD Central Business District, and that's the only place in the current code where that exists. In the new LDC, we're proposing parking maximum citywide. So that would be 175% citywide, 125% for centers and corridors, and 100% downtown. And so our thought process behind that is that does help with our TDM first approach to transportation mitigation, of which Upal can explain a little further.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Upal Barua, Development Officer, Austin Transportation Department. So in this portion of the presentation, I would like to talk about some of the major changes in the codes that are associated with Transportation Development Review. Specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the major changes to transportation demand management strategies, transportation impact analysis, and transportation analysis for zoning. So transportation demand management currently is not part of the code. So in this new proposed code, we are proposing to codify transportation demand management, and we are proposing to have a TDM first approach in development review, which is consistent with ASMP, where we have a goal of 50-50 motor split by 2039. So what that means is for each and every development, the applicant would be required to do a TDM plan for developments, regardless of the threshold in trip generation on daily basis. So the relation is if there is a development that generates less than 1,000 trips a day, they will have to do a TDM plan for that, but no TIA. So when a development would generate over 1,000 daily trips, but less than 2,000, the applicant will have to do a TDM plan. If they can reduce the trips with the TDM plan below 1,000 threshold, then they won't have to do a TIA. If they can't, then they may have to do a limited scope TIA for that threshold. And again, if a particular development generates over 2,000 daily trips, then they'll have to do both TDM plan and TIA. So the focus is to encourage multimodal developments and multimodal improvements that could come out of developments and to attain that 50-50 mode share goals that we have in ASMP. So moving on to transportation impact analysis, it is again related to TDM. They go hand in hand. So currently we have a code provision that allows a TIA requirement over 2,000 daily trips. In this proposed land development code, again, if there is a development generating less than 1,000 daily trips, they would not have to do a TIA. They'll have to do a TDM plan though. again, between the threshold of 1,000 to 2,000, they will have to do both. TDM plan comes first, then a limited scope TIA in that threshold. Again, over 2,000 daily trips, applicants will have to do both TDM plan and TIA. Again, the focus is to have the TDM first approach to attain the 50-50 more share goals in SMP. A couple of other major changes in the TIA regime in the new proposed code is kind of providing a prescriptive guidance on the TIA scope. In the current code, there is no guidance like how to select the study area for a proposed development for TIAs. So under the current code, we provide a prescriptive method how to select the study area for TIAs. The other thing that we have included in this current code or proposed code is the validity of a TIA. Right now, there is no explicit expiration date of a TIA under the current code. So we are providing or suggesting a validity of 5 years from the approval date of a TIA. Because in 5 years, traffic pattern could change, infrastructure could change, travel behavior could change. So that's why beyond 5 years, there would be a need for a revision in the TIA or a new TIA. Moving on to the need for transportation analysis at zoning. In the current code, there is no explicit requirement if an applicant has to do a TIA at zoning. Some applicants, they opt to do that. Some applicants don't. So we're providing a specific guidance in that process. So at the time of zoning, the requirement would not be to do a hardcore or a traditional TIA. There is going to be a zoning transportation assessment or a ZTA, which will provide an overall understanding of transportation network adjacent to the development, proposed more share goals with TDM application, and it will provide the City Council a basic understanding of potential impacts and possible solutions to the some of the impacts from the developments, so that City Council can make an informed decision based on that. So these are the major proposed changes that relates to transportation impact assessment, transportation demand management, and ZTA or zoning transportation assessment. I'm now going to hand over to Anik for the next steps.
We'll have questions, of course, but the next steps, I want to highlight that we are still accepting map suggestions from the community. They can be downloaded from the website at austintexas.gov/LDC and marked upon and handed in at 505 Barton Springs Road at One Texas Center at the 5th floor until 5 p.m. tomorrow. And we've gotten quite a few that we'll be reviewing and forwarding to Mayor and Council in the coming weeks. And then Planning Commission is deliberating tonight and tomorrow with their final recommendation to you all planned for November 12th. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions on the transportation components or any other components or process.
Okay, who wants to go first? Anybody? You want to start? Go ahead.
I don't mind kicking it off. I might have to go twice. I saw that there are recommendations from the UTC, and I just wanted to ask if your plan was to have kind of a spreadsheet of the few boards or commissions who might review this to kind of let us know what seems agreeable and likely to be incorporated after the first reading or what may not be possible, just so we kind of know how this will go with some of the feedback that you might get.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I was at the UTC meeting last Friday, and they made, I believe, 7 recommendations, some directly to Planning Commission and some for Council. Is that correct, Emily? Or is it all to Council? All for Council.
All to council.
Yeah.
It's all for
I think
us.
their intended audience is both. I think they called a special called meeting. Emily Smith, staff liaison to the Urban Transportation Commission. Their meetings usually conflict with the Planning Commission, so they called this special called meeting to make sure their input was given prior to Planning Commission's November 12th meeting. So I believe their intended audience is both the Planning Commission and full City Council for the recommendations they adopted.
Okay, that's helpful. And my understanding is by charter, the Planning Commission is the only one that by our charter has to provide
Correct.
comment and feedback on this.
So as far as providing the spreadsheet like we did in our first staff report for the boards and commissions from our previous work in draft 3, we were planning only to do that for the Planning Commission, but if it's the wish of this committee to do it for the UTC, we're happy to include that.
Okay. Anne's saying yes. I was just curious.
Okay.
I'm okay with it. I think it's helpful, but especially if the Urban Transportation Commission sent it to Planning and Council, I feel like it would then be involved in the notes that we would look at.
We'd be happy to include that in the supplemental staff report. So November 18th, we plan to, council will be delivered the Planning Commission recommendation memo, as well as our supplemental staff report, our second supplemental staff report that would have the recommendations from Planning Commission that we agree with and why, or don't agree, or are neutral on, that you are familiar with seeing, that many of you all were familiar with seeing during the ASMP process, and we will include the UTC as well.
Okay, fantastic. And there was some reference to transportation criteria manual, and so I wanted to know kind of the overlap of the updates to that criteria manual and the timeline with land use code updates.
Yeah, so I'll start out and then let Danielle add. Danielle is the project manager on the Transportation Criteria Manual. So of the criteria manuals in the suite of manuals, the TCM is at approaching 90% complete, and we've made a commitment to the community. It is a rules posting administrative process that it would go through, but we've made a commitment because it hasn't been updated in so long to have a public process for that. And we're still working out what that would look like, but we're poised to have it go to about 100% in the spring. So we're thinking about the Development Review Division in Transportation is going to have a third community listening session with the development and design community, because we've made a lot of changes to the development review process over the last year in creating a development review division in transportation. And as part of that, that is where we would like to create we have a bullet list of all of the things that we've heard through code testing, and also just things that we know need to be updated in preparation for the draft coming out, that we can start releasing, for lack of another word, to the community. So that is where that project is, and we feel pretty good that it will be in place next year at some point, probably after the code, but close soon after.
Okay. And the last question I had jotted down was about the transportation director's ability to, reduce density based on vehicle trips. And I wasn't sure how vehicle trips and person trips might change, especially if this is a code that's going to last for a few decades and hopefully be a living, breathing document that can be very adaptable. How we're going to be able to calculate our ability to change mode share options and what that's going to do to density and things like parking.
Good question. So one of the recommendations from the UTC was to, and we've heard it from a few others in the community as well as we've been getting feedback, that in the code there's references to vehicular trip, there's reference to just trip, there's also reference to street, right-of-way, easement, thoroughfare, and so we are working through, we have a copy editor on board, and we're working also through with Public Works and others to figure out, when do we actually mean easement, when do we actually mean right-of-way, et cetera. And so, and also defining when we actually do mean a vehicular trip, and is it a car trip? Does it also include a bus trip, or is it truly a person trip? And so we're definitely working through that, and we'll provide clarity prior to the final code being finalized. But I believe Upal wanted to add to that.
Yeah, just to add to that, even in the current process, we always look at vehicular trips, pedestrian trips, bicycle trips, and transit trips. Okay. So we do not focus on vehicular trips only in the TIR process. And the other question was about the director's ability to reduce density. It was basically for public safety concerns. If there is a development that generates, like way more trip, that could impede public safety or endanger public safety. In that case, we would not recommend that development, or would recommend to reduce the density for the development. That was the
That's
Yeah, it
really
was-
helpful. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure as we're kind of trying to marry the transit priority network and corridors with development that we were kind of calibrating for mode shift and hoping that not everyone's trying to drive a car,
exactly.
a half a mile.
Yeah, the authority provision is in the current code today and is being carried forward with a few modifications for clarity, and it's meant to be used in extreme cases. In my history with the city, over 20 years, we've never used it until recently. There was an opportunity where we were able to use it to get some increased mitigation with regards to what we really felt was an important safety and mobility issue. So it was a very useful tool to have. But I certainly understand the community's concern with it. But again, it is something that has been in the code with a history of various different policies and direction that the city has had throughout the years, and again has never been used. It's used sparingly.
Okay. And I've got one more question, but I don't want to hog the microphone. Okay. I noticed in our open house, it was brought to my attention, we have a spot near the White Oak Hill that had been zoned to R4, but the bus only picks up twice in the 7 o'clock hour and then drops off twice around the time to go home for a general 9 to 5 worker. And so I had started working with my transportation policy advisor. Is there maybe another option for calibrating places where you don't really have like a 30-minute bus stop or a 15-minute bus stop? So I don't know the answer, but I wanted to kind of put that on y'all's radar, that we may be kind of looking at places like that where my district only has essentially a morning pickup and an evening pickup, and it's not necessarily going to work for people who want that missing middle, that aren't working 9 to 5. It won't provide for hourly workers to be able to utilize transit. So I just wanted to kind of daylight that here. Not that I need an answer or a solution.
So I think that it could be a potential strategy in TDM to increase the bus frequency, like where it is needed for new developments.
Okay, thank you.
I had a follow-up.
You finished, right?
I'm good.
Okay, go ahead.
I had a follow-up question about the transportation criteria manual. Did you say that it will be ready? You said by the end of the next year.
Yes.
So if we pass, assuming it passes in February, when every time the code refers to the transportation criteria, it's referring to the current one, I'm assuming?
Yeah, it would. Yes, the most current one that's adopted would be in play until it's updated.
Okay. So it would be the one that's in existence right now.
Yeah, Danielle's
Okay.
saying it will be, we're shooting for March for a new transportation criteria manual, so
Mhm.
it would be close. But if there was a gap, it would be the old one
Okay,
until the new one is adopted.
thanks.
Other, Councilmember Alter, did you?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to go back to the accessible parking slide, which we can't get up there, but I just want to make sure that I understood what you said, Danielle. So you said that we'd have more accessible parking in cases when we had no parking than we have under the current code, not that we would have more accessible parking than we do under the current code.
Sorry, say that again.
So at one point you said that it was relative to having no parking, that we'd have more accessible parking, and at one point you made it sound like it was more accessible parking overall, and I wanted to get clarity on which was what you meant to say.
So currently, accessible parking is based on the number of parking spaces provided. In the draft LDC, that would remain the same unless there's a case where no parking is provided.
Okay.
Then the accessible parking is based on 100% of what would be required.
Okay, so in the case that there's no parking, then you'd have more parking.
Then you would have
under it.
more than
Okay.
what's under current code.
Okay, and then if they provide more than the minimum, then the accessible parking is still a portion.
It's still
that.
based on what's
Okay.
provided, correct?
Great,
yeah.
thank you. I want to get some clarity on that. And then on the parking slide, when you talked about the minimum parking not required within a quarter mile of centers, corridors, or TPN, and then you talked about like the absent sidewalk, but if it was high, very high, then it would be okay. It would be considered accessible. If they didn't have a sidewalk and it was high or very high ranking, then it would be considered accessible. Is that correct?
Yeah. You wanna go?
It wouldn't be considered, accessible in the sense of we feel that there would be a close temporal proximity of, a missing middle that went in the transition zone, a missing middle development with a pretty close time frame that the route would be completed because it's on the high, very high network or high, very high prioritization for absent sidewalk.
Okay. So does that, if on an accessible sidewalk route to corridor, if absent sidewalk segments ranked high, very high, apply to all three of those situations or just to the TPN?
All three. Well, it applies within a quarter mile of corridors, centers, and the TPN.
Okay.
Right.
And then you made a comment, which is what I most wanted to clarify, about fee in lieu and how that would help to fund those sidewalks. But I don't know of any fees that would be in lieu of if you're not required to do parking. So is that a sidewalk fee or which
It's a
fee?
sidewalk fee, yeah.
Okay.
So that was confusing when we first got the council direction. We were trying to sort this out as well. And I will note that in talking with Public Works as we were working through this recommendation before we released the staff recommendation, that is when we discovered that about 71% of the sidewalks within that quarter mile would be complete by 2024 per the 2016 mobility bond, which is fantastic. It's a higher rate than other parts of the city, so we're really, tying our land use and transportation investments together and policies and investments together. So the fee in lieu for sidewalks in the current code, there is language, and we talked about this a lot in the previous work with the code. We're strengthening staff's ability to decide when a fee in lieu is appropriate or when we would like the sidewalk constructed. Because we're making such rapid progress on the sidewalk network, our capital improvement program, they have a solid work plan and they know where they're going to be, and they will be able to determine how quickly a route, is it better to get the fee because they're working in an area over here and they want to complete that first, or is it better to get the sidewalk section in front of the development that is happening. And so it was a pretty lengthy discussion, and we felt pretty good that this was making progress in that way. So the fee in lieu is not related to the parking, but it's related to the sidewalk fee in lieu.
Okay, so the proposal is to have more flexibility in whether that gets built or whether it goes into
On staff side, yeah.
staff side.
Yeah, on staff side. And it would be either they're going to build the sidewalk in front of their development, and if they're, as Danielle said, they could also extend their limits of construction and build a sidewalk, fill a gap closer to the corridor as well in order to not do the parking. But if there's any sort of gap, we would still require, I believe, 50% of the parking to be required. So you wouldn't be able to go to zero unless you had that completed route in one way or the other.
Okay, explain that again. So
Okay.
I don't have to pay I don't have to build my sidewalk. I can pay fee in lieu, but if there's no sidewalk, I have to build 50% of the parking, or how did that?
Yeah, if the sidewalk is not complete to the corridor, 50% of the parking would be required, unless the gap is ranked high, very high. So if the gap is ranked high, very high, or there's a complete route, you can have zero parking.
Okay, but most of those are ranked high, very high.
A lot of them are.
Yeah.
A lot of them
Okay.
are. Yep.
So
And I'm working on a map that will be out with the supplemental that shows all the existing sidewalk and absent sidewalk that are high, very high, because we also have, as y'all probably remember, in the sidewalk plan, we also have a prioritization for rehabilitation, which is also in the code, in the draft that is not in the code today. that we can require rehab of existing sidewalks that don't meet our TCM standards for ADA and/or for width. And so that's being strengthened as well.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm excited for us to get this sidewalk network built out. And then under the parking maximums, it said that there was a citywide maximum of 175%. What does that mean in a residential area if I want like a circle drive and I choose that and my impervious cover allows that and like I've got way more than my 2 cars and
Yeah.
that, what does that mean?
So
in
that would
practice?
mean that if, let's do easy math, if 10 parking spaces were required, or if 1 parking space was required, you would have to, the max you could provide is 1.75, which would round up to 2.
Okay, but if I'm at my own house and I'm deciding, like, I don't know if this is only apply to commercial or if I'm multifamily, I'm an individual home and I want to have parking for 8 cars for some reason and I have the impervious cover. Does this prevent me from doing that, or does this? And that may be an
We'll get
extreme
back to you on
example.
that.
I'm just don't
yeah.
understand what it. I don't understand
Yeah.
what it means to have a 175% citywide, particularly in the residential areas.
Right, we'll get back. I believe it's anything 6,000 square feet or higher is how it's written, but we'll get back to you all on that. We can enter it into the council question for you if you'd
Okay.
like, and then respond that way.
I would like to understand that. And then for the TDM, how do you determine that a mode option will work? Like, I think we have some sense from the traffic counts and, when we add it up, we know how many vehicles can flow through, and it just seems slightly more scientific, although we had some examples the other day where it wasn't so scientific. But how do you know, like, how many people a mode, like a sidewalk or a bike lane serves and will actually come out of that?
So basically,
Traffic.
for a particular development, they will have to do, or the applicant will have to do a TDM assessment. And we in Transportation Department, we have developed a TDM toolbox based on our study all over U.S. So there had been other studies in other areas that provides a % reduction in vehicular trips. So if they implement certain type of measures, how much trip reduction they're going to get. So we have it in our website under ATD. So the applicants can use that and do a TDM assessment for which particular TDM measure, how many trip reduction they're going to get in the TIA process.
Okay, and this is a toolkit that's based on best practices.
It's based on best practices all over U.S.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question is for I think you said a zoning transportation assessment. If we do it that way, how do we make sure they actually do stuff to reduce the traffic? What are the enforcement mechanisms using a ZTA and for a TDM?
So one of the reasons that we introduced ZTA, not a hardcore traffic impact analysis at zoning, is because at the time of zoning, more often than not, the applicants don't exactly know like how or what they're going to develop. They have an idea like what kind of development they're going to do apart from planned unit developments. So they do like lots of guesses at the time of zoning, and based on the guesses, they have to do a TIA, which is a best educated guess, honestly, with respect to traffic. And also there are certain other issues that at the time of zoning, if they do a TIA and identify certain improvements, if they pay us a fee in lieu mitigation for certain improvements, we can keep it only up to 10 years. So if it goes beyond 10 years, then we have to give it back to the developers. Since like there are so many guesstimations at the time of zoning, it makes sense. We thought it makes sense to have a zoning transportation assessment that would provide kind of an overarching transportation assessment in the adjacent area to a particular development, and do a detailed TIA at the time of site plan when the applicant knows exactly like what they're going to build, what is going to be their number of units, and what is going to be their driveway and everything.
I would add to that I understand what you're asking, and we would set criteria for what would be included in the zoning assessment in the transportation criteria manual, and we would want council to understand, as Upal said earlier, what the impacts are on the network as a whole, multimodal, and what the improvements would likely be based on the ASMP, so that council has that information. If you change the land use, which if Brent was here, he would say, it's a legislative decision on the zoning, that you understand that when and if a site plan is submitted down the road, you have an idea of what the mitigation would look like and an assessment from the transportation department on could it be successfully mitigated? What is the mode share we're looking for in this area? Lots of other criteria. So there would be no guarantee, as you say, that any of that would be done unless a site plan is submitted. So the zoning decision becomes a little bit different, right? You're looking at what is the potential impact, what are realistic mitigation options, does this land use make sense, can it be mitigated, and we would provide you with that information. And then should a site plan be submitted, a TIA may or may not be done depending on how many trips and if they do TDM, and then at that point is when the mitigation would be collected and or required.
So that makes some sense. I'll want to digest that a little bit more, because I think it's a different way of thinking, and there's elements of that sound appealing. But then just broadly speaking with a TDM, one of the concerns that I hear a lot from my constituents is enforcement of a TDM and like what stops them from not taking those steps. And
so with respect to TDM, if we have a multi-phase development and if they have a TDM plan at the time of zoning, then we can hold back some of the subsequent site plans if they cannot comply with the TDM plan they have for the previous site plans, or we can ask for additional mitigation down the road for any of the unmitigated traffic impacts.
And I would add that all of the requirements of the TDM enforcement and I guess what's the right word, mitigation, if things are not working, would be in the plan itself. And that's similar to, some of them include counts and phasing, being able to see how the development is performing. And then what we've seen across the country is that the emphasis is on compliance, not so much on the punishment, but really trying to have that relationship with the development to continue to come into compliance. But enforcement is going to be an aspect of the development review division that we're going to need to grow the capabilities for, should this concept be adopted in the code, for sure.
so can you, in a Q&A, provide some more information on that? I
Absolutely.
think it'd be really helpful for people to have that.
I'll create a question on both of
Detail,
those and put them in the
Thank you.
Q&A. Yep.
And just to add to that, a key component of the TDM plan is to provide, from the applicant to provide an annual report on the trip reduction. So like if they commit that they're going to reduce trips by 30%, they'll have to report back on that every year. So when we review the annual reporting, then we can see for sure that they're reducing it up to 30%. If they don't, then they have to do some additional mitigation for those.
Yeah, so if you could provide some clarity in that,
Absolutely.
and maybe note that in the ASMP it said that TDM enforcement had to be figured out. I don't remember the exact language that we put in there, but I know it had an amendment to that effect. Thank you.
Thank you.
So to the Circle Drive question, I went and pulled up the draft, and what I'm reading is that the maximum doesn't apply if you're under 10,000 square feet.
The parking maximum?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
That's right. I thought it was 6,000, but you're reading 10,000.
I'm reading
Thank you.
it 10,000 in the draft, 10,000 or 25 or more unit, or if it's under 25 units in the development, there's no parking maximum, and if it's under 10,000 square feet, there's no parking maximum. I'm not sure that that's the right way to make that line. There may be another way to make that line. I'm going to think about that. But I don't think it's the market parking maximums really seem to be intended to mass development at a scale.
If what's under 100,000?
Sorry.
Under
10,000,
10,000, is it it's not the lot, it's the
Says
building, right?
Developments over 10,000 square feet in
Development.
floor area.
Okay, floor area.
That's the way it's in the draft.
Okay.
Sorry, and so that is section 23, 3C, 3040, parking requirements in the zoning chapter. So that's one thing. I'm about 700 pages into my read, and unfortunately, I haven't gotten into the transportation chapter yet, but I have read the zoning chapter. The number of parking spaces required, in some cases, I think requires a little more nuance. The per unit, I think, may be too heavy-handed when we're talking about a studio versus a 3-bedroom. And I don't know if the number of parking spaces should be based more on bedrooms or units, or how we might think about that in a more flexible way, and as a unit count in a development. And it's also nuanced for all of us to be thinking about how that applies to a triplex versus a 25-unit complex versus a 300-unit large apartment development. And we're getting all of those things all at the same time. And I'm just wondering if maybe there's a little more nuance that we might want to apply in some of these parking regulations. I don't have a question. It's just mostly what I've been thinking about.
Thank you for the input.
But I would add, a lot of the other stuff you all are presenting is pretty great. Good work. Thank you.
Okay, I have a few questions. So let me just ask a more general question. I think that you responded to some of it, but rather than diving into that detail, let me just ask a more general question to make sure I've got all the parameters for it. So, so generally, the parking requirements. So let's talk in terms of. Well, the parking requirements are proposed for each of the new zoning categories, and they seem to be proposed as blanket requirements. So I'm trying to understand how factors for context sensitivity come into the parking requirements, and that may be what you are referring to when you've talked about. Let's see, when you've talked about some of these aspects of it that you've talked about, but give me the big picture first. How in general are you, or where are all the places where you're taking into account context sensitivity when you're talking about the parking requirements? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, it does. It
Okay.
does. I'll take a stab at it. So when we developed the new zoning categories that are, we use draft 3 per the council direction in creating the new zoning categories. We have the draft that's out. There's fewer of them. So by way of where they're applied and what their purpose and applicability is per definition in the code, that's one aspect of context sensitivity. So
Okay.
the parking requirement is considered on where you might see that zoning district
Okay.
applicable.
Okay.
Or, recommended by staff in the future with a future zoning case, we would look at that.
Where it was mapped, perhaps? Is that
Where it
what
was
you mean?
mapped
Okay.
and where it could be mapped in the future if someone asked for a zoning change in the future. The way that it works now, staff looks at the proposal, looks at the context, and so that was considered as we created the zoning category.
Okay.
So the parking requirements based in context to the use itself, right, on the ITE parking requirements, and then the context of the zoning. So we looked at the international ITE manual for modern recommendations on how much parking should be provided for certain uses. So that's that's the first context, and then it's the zone itself, where it's applied, and should we modify what's required by the ITE standards. And then lastly, by the quarter mile per the council direction. So we further modified. So it was a 3-step of context with what you see with parking, and also with the maximums was also context sensitive to downtown corridors and everywhere else. And I'll also add that it was based on looking at the amount of overparking that we looked at a sample of site plans in different contexts, downtown, corridors within the urban core McMansion boundary, outside, and throwing out the anomalies, which there were some anomalies. What was the general rate of overparking? Because we don't have maximums now. And so we came in, we rounded down on that a little bit, just to make an incremental nod towards our 50-50 mode share. So that's how we came up with those maximums as well.
Okay. So it sounds like then, if I'm hearing right, so context sensitivity, for example, that relates to sidewalks, we've talked about that. So so that's one aspect of it. Have we considered, or have you guys considered bike infrastructure as a factor in context sensitivity? So, for example, does that play a role at all in considering parking requirements for an area? I think the question that people might have is, if you don't have parking on site, the concern, of course, is the tendency to park on the street, and the concern, of course, is parking in a bike infrastructure. So I don't know if that question's been raised to you before, but that's a question we've had. So.
It has not, but I will bring that back to the team. We've had
Okay.
a good history, as you all know, in balancing the need for parking-free bicycle lanes with the need for parking on the street, and looking at the user rate of parking on the street, et cetera. But we haven't considered it with regards to the context for the parking, so I'll take that back.
Yeah, I'm not as concerned about the, bike infrastructure that's separated or protected in some way, because you really can't. I mean, you'd really have to really want to park in one of those places and run over stuff. But but the striped bike lanes present a bit more challenge in terms of the temptation to park in those areas. And so, just curious if that's so. If you could think about that, that'd be
We will.
helpful.
I'll circle
So,
back.
okay, and then any other aspects of context sensitivity? I know that those tend to all relate to sidewalks, though, and you responded to the sidewalk question. So I have a few specific questions then. Okay, so going back to the accessible parking. So I want to make sure I'm understanding that. So, so it's based on the required amount, right? Is that what you said?
Correct.
What if? But I guess I'm a little confused, because if there's no parking required, then what is the AD?
So if there's no parking required, it's what would normally be required in that zoning category if it were not within the quarter mile.
What if
That
there's
makes
no
sense.
parking required in that zoning? That's where I'm getting a little confused. So what is the requirement that it's pegged to? I guess is what I'm trying to understand.
So in the quarter mile,
Mhm.
if you have an office use that's required to have 10 parking spaces, but you build your sidewalk and you connect to a sidewalk all the way to corridor, and you opt to not provide any parking, then the ADA parking would be based on the 10.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I tried it a different way.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is that we have parking requirements unless you take certain actions, so that relate to the access to the corridor, essentially. So it's pegged to the parking requirements.
That's right.
Okay. Let's see. Another question. That.
I have a quick one, Ann.
Yes, go right ahead.
In the loading areas part of the code, there's no off-street requirement for 10,000 square feet or smaller. It's one loading area required for 10 to 100,000 square feet. Greater than that goes to the manual. Do we have requirements related to loading zones in on-street parking? One of the things that I experience, especially on corridors, is loading happening blocking an active travel lane. And I had just anecdotally, this happened once, and I walked into the restaurant where I assumed they were loading, and I asked the guy about it, because there was a loading zone in that building. And he said that it was just easier.
I have to check the exact code right now that we have, but from ATD, our preference is always to have off-site loading for any and all developments. But for exact language in the current code, I have to double check that.
I will say that in my other role as Assistant Director of Transportation, that is the most common waiver that we get with regards to site plans, especially in the downtown, especially along the corridors. So we are considering, because of that, looking at a way to codify allowing it in the right-of-way. And there's still a lot of discussion that still needs to happen. So if there's any comment on that, I hear what you're saying, and so if there's a way to manage it. So, for example, a recent site plan that we did about 8 months ago, that was off of Lakeshore. There was a lot of back and forth, and we put some parameters on it on the time of day, and it had to be signed, and there's going to have to be some enforcement there, but we are letting maneuvering in and out of the right-of-way. So it's something that we're considering through the lens of units and housing capacity, and through the lens of, it's a lot of space.
And I'm thinking about, and I'm thinking about this in part as more of a design allowance, where you might be able to, I've seen streets downtown where the sidewalk and the street are at the same level, and they allow loading at certain times, and at other times when it's more high pedestrian traffic, you don't allow it. What spoke to me about my conversation with the delivery driver was how he was making a very simple and straightforward economic decision about his time. So rather than trying to force delivery drivers into a scenario that they will just ignore, maybe we should lean into exactly how that will work best so that they'll actually use it. And to my mind, it would be the loading zone is right near where they're unloading, and not requiring them to pull into a complicated loading area, which they're just not doing.
We'll take that back because it is something we're considering. So it's a good comment, and we'll see if we can have some words on that in our supplemental that comes out on the 18th.
Cool.
Because it is it's a pinch point for us for sure with regards to mobility, and then also balancing, the development itself and the units.
And obviously, all the delivery trucks that we see photos of blocking bike lanes and blocking sidewalks, and it's just finding the way to square that.
Yep.
I have a follow-up, and so going back to the sidewalk question. So, if I'm understanding correctly, then the determination within the quarter mile is if there is an existing sidewalk on the ground and it's an accessible sidewalk. In other words, it doesn't need repair, right? Or if it's on the list as high or very high. Okay. What if it's not? Okay. Let's talk about a little bit about that high, very high. So it doesn't have to be built yet. It just has to be on the list. Is that right? And what happens if the list changes or if there's no funding? Is the thinking that there's already funded for everything on the high, very high right now? Is that the thinking?
Well, the 2016 bond can only be spent on the high, very high, or that's what we've determined.
That's right.
As you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have the very high ranking for the rehabilitation, which is new with the most recent sidewalk plan. So that's really good that we have those processes in place. And yes, the thinking is that the funding would continue to be, our investments would continue to be good in those areas because and yes, the matrix could change. And the code would always say high, very high, should it be adopted. And if through amendments to the sidewalk plan that come through council, the matrix is changed, then it would still be high, very high, but it would be per the new policy that the council puts in place. And yeah.
Well, I'm trying to remember, and I apologize, but so is there sufficient funding that we've already passed?
For all
high and very high?
No. In talking with Public Works, I believe the delta is quite large. ish, depending on what city you talk to. Other cities have much larger deltas than ours, but it's about 250 million, I believe, for
So
to continue
we're
the high, very high to finish that out. But that we also have to consider that a lot of that should be built as properties redevelop, whether it's a new house or whether it's anything that's being redeveloped in that quarter mile would have to provide the sidewalk or pay the fee in lieu. So it's a partnership. And in talking with Public Works, there's quite a bit of sidewalks that are being built through the development process as well.
Okay, so the
And
thinking,
you know that, yeah.
the thinking is that access from that quarter mile access to the corridor, and which is the reason for the change on the parking, would be addressed either by the city funding sidewalks through the high, very high through our existing bonds, or since that money doesn't go far enough, or through that particular development either doing a fee in lieu or putting a sidewalk in front of their development.
Correct.
So we run the risk then in that situation, or how would we address in that situation? How do we address in that situation where you may have one lot that's redeveloped, and so it's the same problem we have right now. If you have one lot that's redeveloped, and so there's a sidewalk in front of the lot, but you don't have the sidewalk all the way to the corridor. What's the thinking about that? I guess I'm wondering why we didn't just say that the trigger for the no parking really relates to the something more definitive in terms of getting that accessible route to the corridor.
Well, we feel pretty confident that through, we could write Campo grants for citywide sidewalk improvement. There's a lot of way to stretch future dollars with regards to sidewalk infrastructure. And because we know that about 71% will be complete in that area with the 2016, and knowing that the delta would either come from grants, bonds, or the development itself, the impact itself, that we felt pretty confident that the trade-off with trying to, what we heard from benchmark testing is that the cost of parking is high, and if we're trying to address affordability, so it really came from the housing capacity and affordability standpoint, that we would rather get roofs a quarter mile from the corridor in service to trying to reach the 405,000 than the parking, but only in that quarter mile because it does make sense to those corridors that do have multimodal options such as protected bike lanes or transit or what have you. But it certainly is a trade-off. But that was the thinking.
Okay. Councilmember Alter, did you have a...
Yeah, I wanted to first say on the loading, I'm not sure I like the idea of them being in our right-of-way and blocking our main mobility corridors, and I don't know what the balance is. They may not want to use the loading area that's made available to them, but if they're blocking our corridors, and we saw this for months on Lavaca when they had the right-of-way taken out for construction for various buildings, for instance, it's the same thing. It just happens, and then it clogs up the street. And I don't know what the balance is. I understand the problem you're talking about, but I don't know what the right balance is from a transportation perspective, because we don't want folks just blocking our streets because it's convenient for them either.
If I might, I agree completely with that. I don't want it to be confused. What I was suggesting is that the on-street parking might be a loading zone space.
Okay.
Not that we would allow them to block the right-of-way.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Okay. I did not understand that. Thank you for the clarification. And then on the context sensitivity, I serve on the joint committee with the county and AISD, and we've been hearing a lot from AISD about concerns about parking not being required around schools. Most of our schools do not have parking to address the needs of parents. Parents are coming with small children. They're coming and have to go to work. They have to get to places. A lot of these schools are not accessible by public transit. How might we accommodate these concerns around the schools, some of which do fall in these zones where you would have no parking, and it's already really difficult and unsafe at drop-offs, et cetera. But then if you add even more cars to the streets, then it will be, even more dangerous.
So we've had one deep dive meeting with AISD planning staff and CIP staff, and we have another one this Friday. And then I believe we're also presenting to the joint meeting that afternoon, this coming Friday. And so I'd be happy to brainstorm with them. It is one thing on the agenda to talk about the quarter mile and the disruptive through the lens of any schools that might be in that area and get their feedback on that. I'd be happy to report back on Friday afternoon to the joint committee on that.
Okay, yeah, I think there definitely are schools that are impacted by this, and just even the reduction down to one in some places. If you start to divide those up enough, it's going to really make an enormous impact. I mean, you cannot even go in both directions right now, and there's some serious obstacles just given where these schools were cited.
Yeah, initially we didn't define disruptive through the lens of school, but it has come up in several other venues, even among staff. So with this input, we'll be sure and talk with AISD about it Friday morning and get their input.
And if you can let me know afterwards who you're talking with at AISD.
Will do.
Thank you.
Councilmember Alter, can you cite a couple of schools as an example so I can go look them up?
Sure. Breaker Woods is one. That's the one that's in my district that we've been hearing about it the most. And AISD the board members had a whole bunch of other ones, which I don't remember off the top of
It'd just
my
be
head.
good so I can.
It's not every school. Yeah. It's not every school. I think Pease Elementary would be impacted now. Yeah. They may be closing that, so it may
maybe
not.
Cassis as well. I don't remember if that's on the TPN or not, but
I don't know if there's there would be a priority network there as well. I just know the ones in my district more, but AISD has brought it up. For other ones, I think there'd be some over on the east side, like Maplewood and Cherry, like in the Cherrywood area. I don't remember which school is over there, but there are a number of them that are there. When you start to define things that are not like Lamar corridors and Guadalupe corridors, and you start to have the transit priority networks, I think Anderson may end up caught in that as well, although there's no parking on the street there per se. But there are in plenty of them in other districts. I just don't know them.
Even a few is helpful. That makes sure that I'm thinking that I'm able to see the thing that you're seeing. That way we can have a better.
And what happens is that the drop-offs and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of schools that if you did it, no matter what school, if you took that, every school I can think of that happens. I'm trying to think of ones that also have the transit transition zones near them too. And that's
if you
the
took
part
what
that's,
away?
If you make it so that you only have one parking spot and the developers actually took that up and only did one spot, that would have a knock-on effect. Of course, you don't know what the developers are going to do in those areas. They may do two spots because that's what the market bears, but the schools are often very sort of hemmed in, and they're not planned always for the capacity that was there and then the number of people. And we don't offer school buses in a lot of places beyond a certain point. And so if you're going to try to get to work as much as you'd like to walk your kids to school, et cetera, if they're over, if they're a mile and a half away and you're going to try and do that, it just becomes prohibitive to do that.
So that I can understand, that's because that there are schools who use areas that would otherwise be allowed for on-street parking. They use it during drop-off and pickup?
It's used for safe drop-off. It's parents stop, and, when you have a kindergartner, you don't just let your kindergartner off. You get out of the car, you walk them to the classroom, you kiss them goodbye, or you have schools that have assemblies, and so you have, not every parent will show up at an assembly, but you could easily have 50 parents showing up for an assembly, and there's no parking lot. It's just all on-street parking. At the same time, people would still be at their houses because the schools start at 7:30,
okay.
And so it's not the timing particularly for the morning doesn't work. And there are schools that barely have buses because everyone's kind of coming in, and you get an inclement day, and then everything
And
sort
so
of changes. But
part of
it's-
that too is there are schools that don't provide on-site parking because they were built so many years ago or whatever.
Most of the schools do not provide on-site parking for parents. They provide on-site parking for their teachers, and then when you get to the high school, they provide them for students, and there's
Yeah.
no parking for the parents. So like when the parents come for a parent evening, it's usually like the students aren't there, or, you know, some people are walking and then it's like all over the neighborhood. But a lot of the elementary schools that have a lot of parent involvement, they have parent meetings on a regular basis. It's not like this is
Sure.
happening once every 3 months. You know, they can have an assembly 2 or 3 mornings a week. So it's something that they're very concerned about from a safety perspective, and it would be very nice to see a solution in the
Yeah.
code that's not compounding that. And it's,
It'd be good for some of us, I'll just speak for myself, most of the, if I would maybe argue all of the schools in my district were fairly recently constructed, comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot more on property routing and parking and things that are provided in those schools. So it'll be good to go and check out some of the
Yeah, I
examples
mean,
that you've got.
I don't even think Briker Woods has enough parking for the teachers because they're portables. Cassis would have the same thing,
Yeah.
that there's barely enough just for the teachers because of when they were built. O'Henry would have the same thing. And then, you know, you have high schools and then the students are parking. So there's not, I mean, I think it's more of an elementary issue because you're going in and dropping off and you're coming for, you know, the assemblies and other things.
Yeah, I think Zilker's like that too, but I'm not sure if it's actually within a quarter mile. I have to go get my tape measure out for the Zilker
That's a
area.
close one. I don't know.
It's
either.
close. It's close,
I'm
but I'm not sure if it's a quarter mile. But
I
it's
don't
it's
think
like
it
that
is.
too. It
But
doesn't
maybe
have
you can bring a map
parking.
that will help
Yeah.
us see, and
Yeah.
you
I
know,
will
maybe
make
it's
a
just a
map
few,
about
and we
that.
can have some overlays. And just as well, we're talking about schools. I think there is some concern about schools as a broader LDC issue in terms of what they're zoned and
We talked about
and
that
what
this
that
morning.
means for AISD, but also how the zoning choices we're making line up with the capacities at the schools, and to what extent that is factored into
Yeah.
the mapping approach.
Yeah.
And I'll add that.
And I
because this
haven't been
is-
able to get my head around that, but
Yeah.
I have had trustees who are calling and asking
Yeah.
about that, and it'd be really helpful if we could somehow think about the Land Development Code Project Connect and the ASD closures and how these things sort of overlap, but also the capacity issues that AISD has, because while you have undercapacity schools in some places, you have schools that are at 125, 130%, and even after the bond, they are still going to be at those levels.
Okay. I just have one quick question because we're a little over time, but this will be quick. So, a little bit of different shift in question. So, when a tract is on the corner of a corridor, so for I'm wondering about where ingress and egress is. So, for example, if you've got a tract on the corner of a corridor, and on the corner of a corridor, and then a small residential side street, what's the criteria for determining whether the ingress and egress is actually on the corridor or on the residential street? And is there criteria?
So that criteria is the distance from a major road. So if there is a corner lot, they can have drivers on both the streets. It could be on the corridor or could be on the residential street. So there is no code provision to prohibit an access to either of those roads.
So how's the decision made then?
We
Or who
usually-
makes the decision might be the question.
So at the time of site plan, when we see the traffic impact analysis or any sort of traffic analysis, we make sure that there is no queuing issues or safety issues in any of those access points. And based on the assessment, we make the decision like which driveway could be better for operations and safety,
Okay.
or if there is one driveway that is not consistent for safety or operations, then we only recommend one driveway on the minor road.
As an order of process, that would be caught if a TIA is required, or it would be caught during the review of the site itself when we do water quality, we do transportation, just a general review. it would be caught at that stage, and that would be at the decision of the Transportation Department to determine.
Okay, my very last question then. So we were talking about context sensitivity on parking. Was there any was the width of the street considered as part of that at all? Again, within the quarter mile.
No, it was not.
Okay.
We're aware, quite aware in transportation because of just everything we deal with regards to speed mitigation and other things in the urban core, that many of our residential streets are 30 feet face of curb to face of curb, which presents challenges when there's parking on both sides. There's pros and cons to that with regards to creating friction and slowing traffic down, but emergency access is something that we talk about, but it did not come up with regards to the definition of the disruptive parking.
I'm sorry.
Is that what you asked? If we
Well, I was asking, the context sensitivity is a factor to consider when looking at the parking requirements. And so my question is, was the width of the street and related issues like you just mentioned around emergency access or other kinds of issues that occur when you have a narrow or substandard street, was that considered in determining the parking requirements?
parking requirements overall?
Well,
No.
so if you're going to, so we've talked in terms of reducing or changing the parking requirements within a quarter mile, right? So if that quarter mile is on a narrow substandard street, because it just comes in, there's a few places that this occurs where it comes into a corridor or a TPN, then does that impact? In other words, the requirements that we have right now for parking is that relate to whether there's sidewalks, and so we talked about that, but as a context-sensitive factor. But was there any consideration given to the road itself, which really, when you're thinking about the impact of parking along both sides of a narrow or substandard street? So that was not considered?
No.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? So, all right. Thank you. Yes.
And I remember reading this in the code about the 10-year or they can, has that ever happened?
Has it?
Are you asking, has it happened that we have had
Fee
to
in lieu?
return funding?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that
Do,
has happened.
do you know like at what rate that happens? Just curious.
Not-
like
not
10%
very-
of those
Ooh,
eligible
I'd have
for.
I'd have to talk with Andy Linsheisen and get back to you, but we could get back to you on that. It's not very high, but I could not give a number, whether it's 5 or 20%.
And that's basically if a sidewalk isn't eventually built in front. Is that right?
Well, not just sidewalks, for any
It's
any
type of mitigation funding.
of
Okay.
funding that's given for traffic impact.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that after 10 years, we would have to return it if requested, and I believe that we have done that before. Do you have
Okay. Thanks.
So the last thing was a process thing that you had. You had talked about the people can submit maps. I have two questions about that. Can they submit them electronically?
Right now, we don't have that set up. It's just a hand drop off.
So they can't email.
No.
Okay. That would be helpful if there was a way to do that, because some people have the capability to scan, and it's much easier for them to email. To drop it off requires them to actually come to a place and drop it off, which can be
I'll
difficult.
look into that with the corporate PIO team and see if we can update the website to allow for that.
Okay, or just an email would be
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So, okay, and then I've had some folks ask me about what happens next after they submit something like that. And I've told them what I read on the website. I just want to make sure I told them the right thing. And that is that that the team, the LDC team, I guess, would be reviewing that based on the form that you all have posted. And then from there, you pass those along to the district, the council members? Or
Correct.
Okay. So you will be passing along everything that you receive, right?
We'll pass along the actual maps with the cover sheet,
Right.
with comments to the council member whose district it's within.
Okay.
And then we committed to creating an overall summary that we would create
For everybody,
a
yeah.
correspondence to everybody.
Okay.
That kind of outline the themes that we saw with the community
Okay.
mapping.
Okay. So I reassured someone who asked that you wouldn't be rejecting maps. You will have comments on them, of course, but you weren't
Correct.
going to send them back and they weren't.
All maps will be forwarded
Okay.
with comment to how well they were within the boundaries of the
Right.
council direction.
Right. Okay. All right.
one very
Yeah,
quick
go ahead.
In what Mayor Pro Tem was saying about returning fee in lieu fees that aren't used within 10 years, is that a state mandate or a municipal regulation?
I believe it's a city code, but I can double check. It's only for transportation fee in lieu mitigation.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. Other questions? All right. Thank you all very much. This is
Thank
very
you all.
helpful.
Thank you.
As
Thank
we
you all for
continue to
your
read the
input.
code. I don't think I'm on, what is it, 800 that you're in?
I'm 700 in.
Okay. All right. Thank y'all.
And you sang your last sweet song. You prepare to meet your maker. Will your heart be pure and good? Did you try to help your neighbor, doing everything you could? Did you reach out to your brother in his time of need? Did you live